I'm here with Brad Dickerson. He's a behavioral neurologist from Mass Gen. We're here to talk about how to diagnose the difference between Alzheimer's and frontotemporal lobal dementia. Thanks very much for joining me, Brad.
My pleasure.
Is there a comprehensive list of differences and how different dementias present themselves in a person?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right off the bat, we typically hear from patients with Alzheimer's disease that their major problem is with memory, and they're forgetting things that are important to them. So I had a professor who was telling me that, he was really having trouble keeping up with his class this year because he could not remember some of the students' names, even though he used to be pretty good at that the year before. And this was really noticeable to him because in the new academic calendar, he was struggling to do things that he had done fine in the previous academic calendar year, and it had snuck up on him over the last year or so, and his wife had noticed the same kinds of things at home. But it was mostly with forgetting important information that he used to be able to remember with no difficulty the year before. So it was a noticeable change in both of their views of his memory function. That's a prototypical patient with Alzheimer's, and there are many atypical forms of Alzheimer's. Whereas the prototypical patient with the behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia has a normal memory in many cases, normal language, normal functioning in terms of cognition, but their problem is with their personality and their relationship with often their spouse. So it may look like a midlife crisis, or it may look like a psychiatric illness. They may be making some poor judgments, especially in social settings, like making comments to people that they wouldn't have made or shouldn't make in a normal setting, sort of losing their filter. They may be abusing substances in ways that they hadn't before. As one example, we've been working with a woman recently who was a physician and a staunch anti-smoking campaigner outside of the work that she did in her patient care. She was a campaigner against smoking, and one of the early symptoms that she developed was that she had a new interest in smoking. She took up smoking, and her husband thought that was the most bizarre personality change he could have imagined occurring. But along with that, she was not as connected to him, and she was actually starting to have what appeared to be online affairs with men, which was completely out of character for her. They had been married for 25 years and had a very solid relationship up until about a year or so before they came to see us. And this gradually progressed and started affecting her judgment on the job as well. And so the initial thought with her primary care physician was, could she be depressed? Could this be a reflection of a more pervasive substance abuse issue? Could it be a midlife crisis? Could it be a late onset bipolar illness or some other psychiatric illness? So it took a while, along with progression of her symptoms, before she came to see a neurologist, because initially the PCP thought she should go see a psychiatrist. So the prototypical FTD often starts out in some way like that.
So with FTD, is there memory loss that's apparent in the initial stage?
In some patients there may be, but it's a different type of memory loss. A lot of times they are disorganized in their memory, and so sometimes they'll be quite on with their memory, and other times they'll just seem to be forgetting basic information that their family would expect them to know, sometimes about facts or sometimes about recent events, but it has a less consistent quality than a patient with Alzheimer's memory loss typically does.
How does FTD and Alzheimer's present itself differently in the brain?
In the brain, the patient with Alzheimer's in general has a problem toward the back of their brain and deep in the inside memory circuits in between the eyes and the ears.
Is that where the
hippocampus? Yeah. So, and then they have problems in the back of their temporal and parietal lobes back here, in areas that control things like language and visual functioning and some aspects of organizational skills. The patient with frontotemporal dementia tends to have a problem in the front of their temporal lobes or in their frontal lobes. And those parts of the brain are important for conceptual knowledge about people or social norms. That's the front of the temporal lobes. Some aspects of interpersonal connectedness and warmth. And the frontal lobes are involved in things like impulsivity, judgment, or in some cases, problems in the frontal lobes can cause apathy, depending on where the problem is.
Why is it important for a patient or a caregiver to know what type of dementia a person has? I mean, in the end, isn't the care all one and the same?
The real value of this to patients and families is, I think, threefold. Number one, what can they expect? the second question out of a person's mouth after they say, "What's my diagnosis?" is, "What's going to happen to me?" And so helping patients and families plan for their future in terms of the types of symptoms they're likely to experience, the ways we need to be monitoring them, and the kinds of supports they're going to need is a really important thing to start with at the beginning of the journey as best as we can. Secondly, people want to connect with a community in many cases of people that are affected in a similar way. So the Alzheimer's Association, generally speaking, covers the broad waterfront, but a lot of their programs are specialized for people with Alzheimer's. There's also the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration. There's the Cure PSP, a community for people with this rare illness called progressive supranuclear palsy, and there's a Lewy body support network as well. So connecting with those support networks can be a very valuable, empowering step for patients and families to take to help them feel less isolated. And then ultimately, the importance, we hope, will be in targeted therapies. As you say, at the moment, we're best able to treat people's symptoms. Those may not differ depending on the molecular pathology, they differ depending on the symptoms. And you may or may not need a specific diagnosis to develop that kind of a care plan. But if you want to try to connect people with clinical trials that they can enroll in to try to gain access to the next generation of therapies, that's where the more specific diagnosis is often necessary.
So you also see patients as well as conduct research. Is there any trend that you've seen in terms of the number of Alzheimer's versus frontotemporal lobar dementia?
Yeah, I think that the trends I've been seeing are that people want access to good quality care earlier in their condition in many cases. Frontotemporal dementia is a rare disease that we don't have great estimates for the frequency of, but it probably affects fewer than 200,000 Americans, which makes it a rare disease by the FDA's definition. Young onset Alzheimer's may be similar. It may be a rare disease in that sense too, and some people think it may actually be different than typical later onset Alzheimer's, which affects 5 million or an estimated 5 million Americans. So, there's really an order of magnitude difference. But I see more young people in their 50s, sometimes even 40s. We're taking care of a number of people in their 30s. We've seen patients as young as in their 20s with these often very devastating, aggressive forms of these diseases that are quite rare and sometimes very genetically determined. But I'm seeing more people in the prime of their life, in their 50s, in their careers, running a household, doing whatever they're doing that people are dependent on them for, who in some cases are marginalized because nobody knows why they're not functioning at the level that they used to be. And those patients, I think, are coming more frequently for a detailed evaluation and care plan and to try to get engaged in research to do something more specific about the condition that they're suffering from. So I think that's happening, and I think we're also seeing people that want to be more empowered to drive their own care and participate in decisions from an earlier stage of their illness.
Definitely, and knowledge is power, right?
Yes.
Thanks very much, Brad.
My pleasure. Thank you.